Welcome to part 2 of our series on Australia's federal intervention into Indigenous communities. In the first part, we looked at how the historic townships of Kalkarindji and Dagaragu were affected by the takeover. In this part, we'll be joined by long-time advocate of Indigenous rights, David Cooper from Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation. They've recently produced A Better Way, which is a collection of success stories arising out of Aboriginal community control and self-determination.
We developed A Better Way as a response to what was happening up here with the intervention, and also with a lot of the closing the gap policies, which is similarly top-down. And really what we wanted to show that there were a whole range of very impressive Aboriginal controlled organisations and programs that were in existence now, but also have been sort of developed over many years, and that these provide evidence of ways that these issues can be addressed effectively. Well, the intervention's been around for 3 years now, and it really, I think, was a return to, well, not so much a return, it was a continuation of policies that I think the Howard government reintroduced, which were around dealing with Aboriginal Indigenous disadvantage through what they called practical reconciliation means, practical as opposed to symbolic, and dealing directly with health, education, housing, issues like that, but doing it in a mainstream way, sidelining Aboriginal organisations to a large extent. ATSIC, the Aboriginal National Representative Body, was abolished. There was a winding back of the availability of funds and for Indigenous specific programs. So it was very much a return to a mainstream paternalistic approach to dealing with Indigenous affairs, and particularly with dealing with Indigenous disadvantage. And the Northern Territory intervention really picked up on that, and I think took the opportunity to introduce a range of measures that were, most of which weren't new. They'd been talked about, and they had been advocated for by sectors of the conservative commentariat, if you like, and this was an opportunity to I guess apply them to communities in the Northern Territory. And so we had this whole suite of measures that were aimed in the main at reasserting government control, bureaucratic control over Aboriginal lives, over the delivery of services, and really sidelining the ability of communities to be able to participate in policies, and to be able to participate in actually designing solutions and implementing solutions. So this was one of the big problems in relation to it, and of course in order to do that it required them to sideline the Racial Discrimination Act.
Well, they had to suspend the racial discrimination.
Suspend it. Yeah. And for Aboriginal people, that is probably the major, I think one of the major issues, because it's just a demonstration that they're regarded as second-class citizens, that they're not regarded as having the same kinds of rights of other Australians, and that governments think they can just come in and introduce coercive policies without their consent. So for Aboriginal people, this I guess the stigmatisation that was involved in this kind of approach was a very sort of heavy blow, and something that they have put in the forefront in terms of their concerns. We're really talking here about an ideological crusade. This is a battle that's been running in this country for a very, very long time. And we had a period of so-called self-determination policies. In fact, they weren't self-determination.
When would you date that period from?
From about the 70s.
With Gough Whitlam.
With the incoming Labor government. And certainly there was, to a degree, some bipartisan support around those kind of policies. But really they weren't, although they were termed self-determination policies, they weren't genuine self-determination. What was offered really was a very limited degree of Aboriginal control, and in circumstances where Aboriginal organisations and communities were usually underfunded, not given the proper resources to be able to be able to carry out self-determination in a proper manner. And of course that created all sorts of problems. So this chronic underfunding that government has continued to perpetuate on Indigenous communities has been going for decade upon decade upon decade, and this is really why we've seen a build-up of crises in communities, increase in dysfunction. This is due to extremely long-term neglect of governments in terms of providing the funding and the services that communities need.
One of the most alarming elements of the intervention was the compulsory acquisition of leases on Aboriginal communities around the Northern Territory. I asked David Cooper to explain.
These leases were compulsorily acquired on 73 communities in the NT as part of the intervention by the Commonwealth, but their intention is to obtain long-term leases over communities with the objective of being able to control how those communities are developed. So what they're doing is essentially sidelining the control of Aboriginal traditional owners and residents and taking over control by government authorities in terms of how those communities will be developed and what happens in relation to them. So it's really a mechanism to take away any semblance of community control. That we've lost already 2/3 of the Indigenous community-controlled housing organisations in the Territory.
So that ties in with the CDEP stuff as well, because the local organisations that control the housing would also get local people working through CDEP to do repairs and stuff on them, wouldn't they?
Yeah, indeed, and the CDEP issue is a major one. It's one that again has got a bit of an ideological driver behind it, in that it's seen to be a form of it's actually seen to be associated with passive welfare when in fact it's not at all. It's also seen to be an end point, a dead end, if you like. And what the government wants to see is sort of a normalisation towards market economies and normal sort of market opportunity jobs. And their approach to this is to look at the existing network of communities, particularly the outstations and smaller communities, and to deem these to be not appropriate to developing these market economies where all these jobs for Aboriginal people are supposed to come from. And that sort of hastened the destruction of the CDEP, particularly in terms of it being able to provide jobs, CDEP jobs. And again, there's a whole lot of
and services as well.
Services, yeah. I mean, those CDEP jobs were providing and have been providing a whole range of community services, and also supporting Aboriginal Indigenous businesses in communities. And of course, they were also subsidising jobs that should be government provided jobs, municipal services and things like that. And there has been a certain degree of conversion of CDEP jobs across to permanently funded full-time government jobs, but that's only a fraction. And out of about 8,000 people who were on CDEP jobs at the beginning of the intervention, we'll see about at least 6,000 of those by September next year. We'll have seen 6,000 of those transferred from CDEP jobs onto welfare. The government is actually adding to the poverty levels of these communities, the poverty levels of the most extremely disadvantaged members of the community. And they see this as some kind of positive development.
You think they see it as giving them a boot in the arse so they go get a job in the mines or something like that?
There is certainly an agenda, and it's not a secret agenda. It's actually written into the COAG Closing the Gap partnership agreements, that there is an intention that the government wants to, they say, what's the word, to try to get people to voluntarily move to larger centres where there might be more work available or whatever. So to try to get people to move away from homelands and smaller communities into larger centres. And it very much fits in with the government's broader philosophy about social inclusion, which is a very a mainstream view, and it's about, you know, all you need is, you know, you need good education and a job, and everything will be hunky-dory, and, you know, we want everyone to sort of, you know, have the same kind of life. It doesn't really acknowledge the diversity of cultures in this country. It certainly doesn't acknowledge the idea that Indigenous people in this country might want to have their own ideas about how to develop their lives and their communities that might be slightly different from mainstream Australia. This is the big struggle that's occurring at the moment. The government is imposing a mainstream model on Indigenous communities, and Indigenous communities are going to resist that, and they're going to continue to resist that. It's, you know, it's not rocket science.